Imagine waking up one morning to find strangers lounging in your backyard, splashing in the pool you worked years to build. Not neighbors you know, complete strangers, invited there by someone who doesn't even live in your home. The audacity didn't stop there. When I tried to stop it, the HOA told me I was the problem. That's when I realized this wasn't just about a pool, it was about control. So I decided to fight back in a way they'd never forget. But here's the question. When the HOA pushes this far, how far are you willing to go to push back? For years, life in our neighborhood felt almost picture perfect. The streets were clean, the lawns were trimmed, and every holiday, families decorated just enough to make the cul-de-sac feel alive. My wife and I had worked hard to build a home we could be proud of, a place where our kids could ride their bikes safely, where barbecues on summer evenings stretched long past sunset, and where the biggest worry was whether the ice cream truck would make it down our street that week. We weren't flashy, but we took pride in our space. After years of saving, we finally added something we'd always dreamed of, a brand new backyard pool. To us, it wasn't just a luxury, it was a reward for sacrifices, long hours, and choosing this community in the first place. It became our sanctuary, a spot where laughter echoed off the water, where neighbors waved politely as they passed, and where we believed privacy was still something we could count on. But in communities like ours, peace rarely lasts. There are always those who believe the rules bend for them, or worse, that they own the right to dictate how everyone else should live. And while I didn't know it yet, one neighbor was about to turn our simple joy into the center of an ugly battle. The pool we'd worked so hard for was about to become their playground, and my nightmare. At first, I thought the pool incident was an isolated moment of entitlement. Maybe Karen had misunderstood the boundaries, or maybe she just lacked the common sense most neighbors live by. But I quickly learned that this wasn't a mistake. It was the opening move in a much larger game. The very next week, a letter showed up in my mailbox with the HOA's official seal on the envelope. It wasn't a welcome note or a reminder about dues. It was a warning. According to them, my backyard amenity was now a community concern. They cited noise complaints, safety hazards, and even suggested that I had failed to seek proper approval before construction. The irony was sharp. I had every permit, every inspection passed, and I had even sat through endless HOA meetings before the pool was ever dug. But none of that seemed to matter now. Someone had their sights set on my property, and the HOA was more than willing to play along. At first, the complaints trickled in slowly. A note about unauthorized gatherings. A fine for improper fencing. Another notice claiming my pool lights violated community brightness standards. Each one was more absurd than the last. It didn't matter that most of these so-called violations weren't even listed in the HOA bylaws. They were creating rules on the fly, designed to chip away at my patience and my wallet. I tried to be reasonable. I showed up at the next HOA meeting with my folder of documents, lined neatly with permits and stamped approvals. I thought facts would put an end to the nonsense. Instead, I was met with smirks and thinly veiled threats. "We'll review this," they said, "but in the meantime, you'll need to pay the fines." It was clear they weren't interested in fairness. They wanted compliance. They wanted control. And Karen? She was thriving on the drama. She strutted around the neighborhood like she had already won some unspoken war, whispering to neighbors, casting sideways glances at me and my family. More than once, I caught her lingering at the edge of our yard, snapping photos of our pool as if she were collecting evidence for a case that didn't exist. It wasn't just about swimming anymore. It was about dominance, about proving she could bend the rules to her will and drag the HOA in behind her. The harassment escalated. One Saturday morning, I woke to find a group of kids splashing in the pool. They weren't mine, and I had never seen them before. When I confronted them, they sheepishly admitted that Karen said it was okay. My blood boiled. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was trespassing, sanctioned by someone who had no authority. I locked the gates tighter, added cameras, and doubled down on protecting what was mine. But the HOA twisted even that against me. Soon, I received yet another notice: unapproved security measures. According to them, my cameras violated the community's visual harmony. My locked gates were unneighborly. It was as if every effort to defend myself only fueled their next attack. And still, the fines piled higher. $100 here, $250 there. Threats of liens on my property. The numbers added up quickly, and the language in the letters grew sharper, more aggressive. They weren't just trying to wear me down, they were trying to break me. I remember one meeting in particular, standing in front of the board, presenting every receipt, every signed permit, every photograph proving I had done everything by the book. And Karen, sitting smugly in the front row, interrupted me with a laugh. "You're wasting your time," she sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is our community. You can't fight the HOA." Her words cut deep, not because they were true, but because in that moment, it felt like she believed she had already won. And judging by the nods around the room, others were starting to believe it too. The tension at home was just as heavy. My family couldn't enjoy the pool anymore without looking over their shoulders, wondering if they were being watched, photographed, or reported. What was once our sanctuary had turned into a stage for Karen's vendetta. Every splash of water felt like an act of defiance. But instead of breaking me, the pressure did something else. It sharpened my resolve. If the HOA wanted to play games, I was ready to play too. I started documenting everything. Every letter, every photo of Karen lurking, every timestamp for my security cameras. I wasn't just defending my pool anymore. I was building a case. Still, the harassment didn't stop. Late one night, I caught movement near the fence. Through the camera feed, I watched as Karen herself tried to jiggle the lock on the gate. When it wouldn't open, she pulled out her phone, took pictures, and left. The next morning, another violation notice awaited me, claiming my pool access was restricted in a manner inconsistent with community guidelines. Each attack was more brazen than the last, and each response from me seemed to fan the flames higher. It was no longer about rules or fairness. It was a full-on power struggle. And then came the final straw. A notice slipped under my door, stamped in red. Final warning. Immediate compliance required. Failure to respond will result in legal action and potential seizure of amenities. My heart raced as I read those words. They weren't just threatening fines anymore. They were threatening to take away the very thing my family had worked for. And behind every line of that notice, I could hear Karen's laughter echoing. That was the moment I knew the battle was about to change. I wasn't just fighting back anymore. I was preparing to end this. The breaking point didn't come quietly. It exploded in front of the entire neighborhood. After weeks of threats, fines, and sleepless nights, the HOA called a special meeting. The notice they sent claimed it was to address community concerns, but I knew better. This was their ambush, their chance to corner me in public and break whatever fight I had left. I arrived early, documents in hand, my folder so thick it could barely close. Inside were every letter, every photograph, every permit, and every recording I collected. For weeks, I had felt like I was drowning. That night, I intended to turn the tide. The clubhouse was packed, more neighbors than I had ever seen at any meeting before. Some were curious, some suspicious, and some, like Karen, came to watch blood spill. She sat in the front row, arms crossed, a smug grin plastered across her face. Behind her, the HOA board members looked confident, as if the verdict had already been written. The meeting began with accusations. They listed violations, one after another. Unauthorized gatherings, safety hazards, disruptive noise, improper fencing, unapproved lighting. Each claim was met with murmurs from the crowd. Each fine announced like a nail in the coffin they thought they were building for me. When they were finished, the president leaned forward and delivered the final blow. Unless these violations are corrected immediately, the association will take legal action, including the removal of your pool. Gasps echoed through the room. That was it. The nightmare laid bare. They weren't just after my money. They wanted to strip away the very thing my family had built our home around. I could feel my wife's hand gripping mine, her nails digging into my palm. Karen's grin widened, and for a brief second, I swear she mouthed the words, "I told you." But instead of folding, I stood. My hand shook, not from fear, but from anger I had bottled up for too long. "You want to talk about violations?" I said, my voice louder than I expected. Fine. Let's talk. I opened my folder and began laying evidence on the table. First, the permits signed, dated, and stamped. Then the inspection reports, proving every step of construction had been done legally. I held up photographs of Karen trespassing, screenshots from security footage showing her rattling my gate, and copies of every letter the HOA had sent me with violations that didn't exist anywhere in the bylaws. The room shifted. Murmurs grew louder, but this time they weren't against me. Neighbors leaned forward, squinting at the documents, whispering to each other. The board shuffled uncomfortably, and then I dropped the bombshell. I pulled out a recording, audio from the night Karen had trespassed. Clear as day, her voice rang out. "Don't worry, the HOA will back me up. You can't stop us." The room erupted. Gasps, angry whispers, even a few shouts from the back row. Karen's face drained of color. The smug smile erased in an instant. She stammered. That's taken out of context." But it was too late. The damage was done. Neighbors began demanding answers. "Why are you siding with her?" one man shouted. "He has the permits. You can't just invent rules," another woman snapped. The board members looked trapped, cornered by the very people they claimed to represent. I didn't stop there. I revealed the timeline of harassment, the escalating fines, the fabricated violations, the threats of seizure. I showed how the board had ignored every piece of evidence I'd given them while accepting Karen's word as gospel. Piece by piece, I stripped away their authority until nothing was left but the raw truth. This wasn't about community standards. This was about power weaponized against one family for one neighbor's vendetta. The room had transformed. Where I had once stood alone, now the weight of the crowd pressed against the board. People who had never spoken up before began shouting for transparency, demanding accountability. The board president's face was pale, his voice trembling as he tried to restore order. But the tide had already turned. And then came the moment that sealed everything. A neighbor stood up, an older man, quiet, respected, someone who had lived in the community far longer than most of us. He looked directly at Karen and said, "We welcomed you into this neighborhood, and you've done nothing but poison it. This isn't about him. This is about you. And we're done letting you ruin it for the rest of us." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that cuts deeper than any scream. Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time, she looked small, cornered, powerless. The board, sensing the shift, scrambled. They backtracked, claiming they would review the evidence thoroughly and suspend fines pending further investigation. But the crowd wasn't buying it. They wanted change, and they wanted it now. I didn't need to win every battle that night. I just needed to show the truth, and once it was in the open, there was no going back. Karen's reign of control, her smug confidence, the HOA's blind backing, it all cracked under the weight of undeniable proof. Walking out of that clubhouse, I felt the air lighter than it had been in months. Neighbors I had barely spoken to shook my hand, patted my back, even whispered apologies for not stepping in sooner. And behind me, I could still feel Karen's glare burning, her world collapsing around her as she realized the fight she started had ended, not with my pool destroyed, but with her reputation in ashes. But if you think that was the end, you'd be wrong, because tearing down the lies was only the beginning. What came next would change not just my family's life, but the entire neighborhood forever. In the days following that explosive meeting, the entire atmosphere of the neighborhood shifted. For months, Karen had walked the streets with her chin held high, wielding the HOA like a weapon. But now, her swagger had been replaced by silence. Neighbors who once whispered nervously around her now avoided her entirely. Or worse, confronted her outright. Word spread quickly, as it always does in communities bound by fences and gossip. Everyone knew about the recording, the trespassing, the fabricated claims. People who had quietly endured their own HOA frustrations finally felt emboldened to speak up. And suddenly, Karen was no longer the self-appointed gatekeeper of the neighborhood. She was its cautionary tale. The HOA board, shaken by the backlash, tried to regain control. They sent out a formal letter acknowledging that mistakes had been made and that they were committed to fairness and transparency moving forward. It was corporate fluff, carefully worded to avoid admitting liability, but the meaning was clear. They had been caught, and now they had no choice but to back down. The fines against me were dropped. Every so-called violation was erased from the record. But the damage they had tried to inflict, the stress, the sleepless nights, the wedge driven between me and my family, couldn't be undone with a single letter. So I pushed further. I requested a full audit of the HOA's practices, and with the support of dozens of neighbors, I forced a vote to replace several board members. To my surprise, the turnout was overwhelming. People who had never bothered to attend meetings before showed up, some carrying stacks of their own letters, fines, and grievances. It wasn't just about me anymore. Karen's vendetta had lit a fire under the entire community. By the end of the vote, 3 board members were gone, replaced, and in their place were people who had lived in the neighborhood long enough to understand that rules were supposed to protect, not to punish. For the first time, the HOA felt less like a dictatorship and more like what it was meant to be, a group of homeowners looking out for one another. As for Karen, her downfall was swift and merciless. The neighbors she once rallied to her side stopped answering her calls. The friends who attended her parties stopped showing up. The pool she had tried so desperately to claim was now locked tighter than ever, and not a single person dared set foot inside without my permission. The smug smiles, the whispered threats, the late-night prowling of my fence, they were gone. She had been exposed, and there was no hiding from it. But her silence wasn't enough for everyone. More than one neighbor demanded she step down from any role she held in the HOA. Eventually, under the weight of public pressure, she resigned her position as community liaison, a self-appointed title she had wielded like a badge. Without it, she was just another resident. And for someone like Karen, that was the cruelest punishment of all. Life slowly returned to normal for my family. For the first time in months, my kids could swim in the pool without glancing nervously toward the street. My wife could host barbecues again without worrying that we'd get slapped with a noise violation. Even I could sit on the patio, the sound of water lapping against the tiles, without feeling the shadow of the HOA hanging over me. But the impact went deeper than just peace of mind. The neighborhood had changed. People who once kept their heads down now spoke up when something didn't feel right. The HOA meetings, once empty and dull, became lively and crowded, with homeowners demanding transparency and holding the board accountable. It was as if the entire community had woken up, realizing that silence only fueled abuse. And the pool that had been at the center of it all, became more than just a backyard luxury. It was a symbol. Every time I heard my kids laughing as they splashed in the water, every time a neighbor waved from across the fence without fear of reprisal, it reminded me that standing up to bullies, no matter how powerful they seem, is worth it. Karen's story didn't end with one meeting. Rumors swirled that she put her house on the market, though no for sale sign ever appeared. Whether she stayed or left, she had lost the one thing she craved most: control. And in a community as tight-knit as ours, reputation is everything. Looking back, I realized something important. The HOA wasn't the villain by definition. It was the people who abused its power. Rules can keep a community safe, protect property values, and give neighbors a sense of order. But when those rules are twisted by ego and entitlement, they become weapons. And like any weapon, they can be turned against the very people they were meant to protect. So here's the takeaway. If you ever find yourself facing down an HOA or a neighbor who thinks they can control your life, don't back down. Document everything. Know your rights. And most importantly, don't fight alone. Because once people see the truth, once they realize they're not powerless, everything changes. The pool still glistens in my backyard, a reminder of what we fought for. And sometimes late at night, I stand by the water and think about how close I came to losing it all. Not because of laws or rules, but because of one person's arrogance. And then I ask myself the same question I'll ask you now. When someone tries to take what's yours, how far are you willing to go to take it back?